In the past few videos, you might have noticed this thing in the background of some of my videos. And you might have gone, what the hell is even that? So, what is this thing? Well, this is my scanning frame. And this is something that I built to make my DSLR scanning experience much better, much easier, and much more reliable and reproducible. Now, the reason I've built this thing is because the cheap copy stand that I used to use actually worked fine when I was just using a camera and a macro lens because there wasn't much weight involved. But as I started upgrading my gear for scanning and started using bigger, heavier cameras, along with more specialized lenses and a bellows unit, all of the extra weight was really starting to show the limits of that cheap copy stand, and it was actually starting to flex too much for scanning. So with all of the extra weight, it was pulling the stand down too far to the front and was causing a lot of flex this way. But it also wasn't stable enough to hold the camera and keep it from rotating on its axis because there was only one bolt holding it in place, so it was rotating quite easily. And it just made setting up the scanning very difficult and very finicky. And because of all these issues, I decided to build a super stable, super strong, and super sturdy scanning frame to hold all the parts of the scanning together so that it would work much better. So the base material for the frame is 2020 extruded aluminium with T-slots, and this is actually a really nice material to work with because it's all standardized. So all I had to do was, once I designed the frame and how it was going to work, was just cut all the pieces to the right length, and then I just bought all these extra bolt plates online and bolted the whole thing together. There's no welding involved or anything like that, it's all just nuts and bolts to hold the whole thing together. Now, as for the scanning gear itself, the Film Advance system is the negative supply Film Advance, so I'm using their 35 and 120 carriers along with their Pro stand, which is actually bolted to the frames. The light source I'm using is the negative supply 99 CRI 4x5 light source, which is actually a great light source. It's really good for doing color film and it helps produce more accurate colors because of that high color rendering index. Now, this little gadget here is a Kinetronic StatVac, and this is an electronic static electricity discharger for film, and that means then that the dust comes off much easier so the brushes can loosen it, and then there's a fan with a filter in the back that blows air across the film to remove any dust. Now, the camera itself is actually mounted on a Nikon PB4 bellows, and the bellows is bolted solidly to the frame itself, so it can't shift, rotate, or move at all away from the frame. And this is one of the reasons why the whole thing is so goddamn steady. Now, the reason I'm using a bellows is because the lenses that I'm using, which I'll talk about later, require a bellows for focusing. Another reason I built this frame, apart from the stability, is to solve another really annoying problem with camera scanning, and that is getting the film and the lens and the camera to be perfectly parallel to each other so that the film sits perfectly in the plane of focus of the lens. So to fix that on this frame, what I've actually done is I've bolted the base plate of the bellows with 2 bolts so it can't rotate or move directly to this top bar, which is then bolted all the way down in multiple places and is set up to be just have no flex at all basically. So now that the bellows is mounted to the frame really solidly and it won't move at all, what I did then is I used the mirror trick to level the Pro stand from negative supply. Now, the leveling for this was done by using nuts and bolts underneath the frame here, and I used a bunch of tiny shim washers about 0.2 millimeters thick to raise or lower each corner to make sure that the whole thing was sitting perfectly parallel to the lens. And by using a mirror, I was able to make sure that everything was aligned absolutely perfectly. And in terms of the accuracy, it's somewhere around 0.1 millimeters of up or down on either end of a 35mm piece of film. So this thing is insanely precise now and it's absolutely perfect. And when we talk about the particular lens I'm using for 35mm, you'll see why it needed to be this accurate. So for scanning normal 35mm frames, I use the negative supply 35mm carrier. This is their first version of their Pro carriers. I think there's a new carrier out now, but I don't really see the need to buy that because this one works fantastically. and I don't use an X-pan or anything like that, so I don't need the extra gate size. But the real special thing about the 35 setup is the lens that I'm using. And you'll notice that it's a little bit unusual looking, and that is because this lens is actually from a Nikon Coolscan 8000. Now the reason this lens is so good for scanning is because of how well optimized it is for one-to-one scanning. It has literally been designed for that purpose exclusively. Now what that actually means is that at one-to-one, this is the sharpest lens that you can get your hands on within reason. I think the only other ones that are sharper are like the printing Nikons, and those are like 5,000 quid a piece. So this lens is insanely sharp at one-to-one. The other thing about this lens is that it has no practical light fall off or vignetting. It retains its sharpness absolutely perfectly corner to corner across the entire piece of film. It's also a fully apochromatically corrected lens. What that means is that at one-to-one, this lens has no chromatic aberration. It's actually corrected into the infrared spectrum and into the ultraviolet spectrum. Now the reason for that is because in the Coolscan, they had an infrared scanning mode for dust removal. So the lens has to be apochromatically corrected so that the infrared scan lines up perfectly with the visible light scan so that the dust removal actually works. It also has zero distortion and a completely flat field. So this thing is optimized for projecting a flat surface to another flat surface absolutely perfectly. Now that sounds great for scanning because that's what the lens is designed for. But if you go outside of that use case, the lens is kind of ass. So outside of one-to-one, the quality of this lens falls off really quickly, and the sharpness and chromatic aberrations start to rear their ugly heads really badly. The other thing is that this lens, because of its optical design, actually can't focus to infinity. So you can't really use this as a general purpose macro lens. Now those are only small disadvantages compared to the big one, and that is the fact that when you get one of these lenses, it doesn't actually look like this, which has been modified. Instead, it looks like this. And effectively what it is, it's just a tube of metal with glass inside. There is no mounting hardware on these at all. There's not even a thread you can screw an adapter into. So the way I managed to add some threads and mounting hardware to my lens is that I found some really cheap extension rings for a micro four thirds camera online. And it turns out that they had a 52mm filter thread, which is perfect. And it also turns out that the inner diameter of those extension rings was almost the exact same size as the outer diameter of the lens. Luckily I have access to a workshop with a lathe, so I was able to take those extension rings and turn them down to the exact right size so that they fit perfectly over the lens barrel. Here's the rear sleeve now. Perfect fit. Exactly right. Almost zero play. And then for the front sleeve, this is a piece I just turned. It fits on and it is an absolute tight fit. Like so. And now it has a filter thread on the front. So that's pretty good. So if we put this over the back, we glue it together. And then with that done, I use some aluminium tape as a shim to make sure that they fit perfectly snugly. I then use some long set epoxy to glue the sleeves onto the outside of the lens. And that means that this lens now has 52mm filter threads on the front and rear. Then all I had to do was take a F-mount to 52mm reversing ring and just screw it onto the lens like so. And now there's an F-mount on the lens and it can be mounted. I also have this lens hood. This is actually two lens hoods just screwed together. So one of them is like a 52mm lens hood to like a 58mm thread, I think, and then I got a 58mm rubber lens hood to go on top. And now I can scan my film. Another issue with these Coolscan lenses is that they don't have apertures at all. And this lens being 100mm and around an f2.8 fixed lens means that at 1:1 the depth of field on this is incredibly shallow. Like we're talking 0.5mm of depth of field. So that means if you're using this lens and your film is not absolutely perfectly parallel to the lens itself, you're going to end up getting the edges of the image starting to drift out of focus really easily. And that is one of the main reasons why I built this scanning frame, is because my old copy stand simply wasn't precise enough to be able to use this lens at all. I found that it was just drifting out of focus way too easy. So for 120 film, I use the negative supply 120 Pro carrier that I just sit onto the base plate. Now, when you're scanning 120 film, the major issue here is that I can't use the CoolScan lens because it's so optimized for 1:1 that if I use it for 120 film, it starts to lose its sharpness way too quickly, and I have to move the lens up really high. And even then I can't even scan like 6:9 format because the lens literally doesn't cover it. So in order to scan 120 film, I have to use a different lens, which is this. And this is the APO Rodegon D 2X 75mm f4.5 enlarging lens. Now the reason I use this lens is because this is an enlarging lens that has been optimized for 1 to 4x enlargements. So that means it's designed for projecting an image 4 times larger, or reverse projecting in this case when you're scanning an image 4 times smaller, which is exactly what you're doing when you're scanning 120 film. You're taking a larger negative and projecting it down to a smaller digital sensor. I managed to find a little lens hood online that fits perfectly fine, and it actually has a 52mm thread on the front, so I can take the lens hood off the CoolScan lens. That's basically how I scan 120. Now when I'm scanning 645 images, I do rotate the camera 90 degrees. And this allows me to use a lot more of the sensor area when you're scanning 645 images. As for the carrier itself, it works fine. However, I have found that it doesn't hold the film perfectly flat. Now it's not too much of an issue here because you can stop this lens down and you should be able to get the entire image in focus. But I have found if you're using like longer negatives, like 6:9 in particular, it can be quite hard to get a really nice scan. So I do plan to buy the full border scanning kit for this, which adds in a piece of A&R glass underneath the film. And then the actual clamp here on the top will just clamp it down to the glass, and that will hopefully hold the negative a lot flatter. Apart from that little niggly bit there, the carrier does work well, and this is effectively how I scan 120 film. Now for scanning large format 4x5 sheet film, I don't actually use the negative supply 4x5 holder. I do have one, and to be quite frank, it's ass. So to scan 4x5, I use this. Now this is the 4x5 film carrier for an enlarger. And I bought this new from Japan off some random website. I cannot remember where I found this damn thing online. But effectively, it's just a film carrier for an enlarger for 4x5 film. So there's a piece of A&R glass here. In fact, there's actually two pieces of A&R glass. There was one up here, but I've actually removed it and I just placed some foam in. So to load 4x5 film into this, what I do is I place the film emulsion side down onto the foam. Then I just close this over to lock the film in place, flip the carrier over, and then I just place it on the base plate directly. Line things up, and then using the same APO Rodegon lens, the 75mm, it works for 4x5 as well. I just then take a picture of the film. It's really quite a simple setup for 4x5, and it works really nicely. As for dealing with the scans in Lightroom, it's honestly pretty similar to everyone else's setup. You know, Negative Lab Pro, Lightroom, create positives, edit scans, all the same kind of thing that everyone else does. When I'm actually working with my images, I have this folder structure that I use, and it's set up with digital and film scans in the same folder, and then, you know, processed, exports, Instagram versions, and so forth. Now in my raw scans folder, I actually have a bunch of scripts that I use, which I think are quite useful. So one of these scripts is the compressed JPEG script, and this uses ImageMagick to convert all of the JPEGs that were captured down to small thumbnails. So by default, I have the D850 taking extra fine full-size JPEGs, and they're about 20 megabytes a piece. I run this script, it takes all the JPEGs and crushes them down to like 720p medium quality JPEGs, which are like 100 kilobytes a piece. So that saves a lot of space. I also have a bunch of scripts for like compressing TIFFs down to various sizes for different resolutions and films. got a few different photos here, mostly color negative, that need to be inverted. One thing you might notice is that all the scans are pretty much filling the entire frame. I leave a little bit of black or a border around the outside of each picture, but for the most part I set up the scanning rig, and this is why the bellows with the 2 standards is so useful. I set it up so that I fill the frame as much as I can for each photo. Most people normally set the white balance by picking a blank area of the film. I actually don't do that. Instead, what I do is I set the white balance in camera, and I take a white balance reading through the film itself. I find that this tends to work better and produce more consistent inversions. It also means that for each roll the white balance is consistent, and I think it just helps quite a bit. And then in Negative Lab Pro you can see that I've got the border buffer set to 5% with a preview, so that just crops in and will only use this section here of the image for calculating the inversion. This is really useful. For color model I use Frontier, and then Source Digital Camera, Pre-Saturation 3, Convert Negative, and there we go. It looks pretty decent. Now when it comes to like editing in Negative Lab Pro, I actually just don't bother. I honestly just use make a copy, make sure sharpen is off, and I just have it set to linear, and I just hit apply. Now what this does is it makes a positive TIFF copy in a subfolder, and then I actually edit this TIFF copy. So what I'll do then is I'll just crop an image in, change the white balance a little bit. This image is fairly warm, but it was shot on gold. I'll just do a little bit of contrast. I generally pull the blacks down quite a bit and pull the whites up to like a little bit of saturation, a little bit of dehaze, and then I'm going to do a little bit of sharpening, not much. And that's really it. I'm very, very hands off when it comes to my editing of film scans. Now digital is a different story. I do quite a lot of adjusting there, but I tend to let the film color shine through, whatever that means. But I find Negative Lab Pro's colors are actually so good with this. With the high CRI light, I generally don't need to adjust it too much. Sometimes I might need to adjust the white balance a little bit, and I'll just use the white balance dropper. So back of the Swan, that's actually quite nice now. It added a little bit of green and warmed it up slightly. Then what I do is I just press 1 to set the rating of the image to 1, which marks it as a keeper. And then I can use the filters option to filter my rated images. And then I just export all the images that I want. We'll do this one here. This is a 6:9 shot from Hiroshima. So Negative Lab Pro, Frontier, Convert. That's looking pretty decent. A little bit of flare here from this light. Sometimes I do linear flat, but I find linear works pretty well. Linear flat is when it's like ultra contrasty. I tend to use that for slides, so I'll apply that. I normally spend a bit more time with this. This is only a demo. I need to remove some fuzz. I just use the Lightroom removal tool to remove dust and stuff. If it's a lot of dust, or if there's like a massive hair or something that I didn't catch, I tend to export the image to Photoshop and remove all the dust that way. I think that's okay. It's starting to show up in the sky quite a bit, the grain, but it is quite dark in that area, so the grain's going to be a little more exaggerated. You can see where I focused on the actual atomic bomb dome to frame it running down Peace Park. For black and white images, I do the exact same thing. I just set the pre-saturate the color model to black and white, convert negative. So this is actually a very contrasty image, so I'm just going to put it linear flat. Give me a little more room to work with in Lightroom. Wait for it to create the positive, and the image looks pretty decent. Obviously I haven't cropped out any of the dust and hairs. So one issue with DSLR scanning is the dust, but I found that with the, you might think, why don't I use a normal scanner and use ISRD or something similar? I used to, and I actually stopped and went back to the DSLR scanning because I found that I was actually culling a lot of the images. So on a roll I might only actually process 10, and I was able to edit out most of the dust myself anyway, as fast as the scanner would actually take to scan the images in. So I chose to do a little more of a manual process rather than automating it with the scanner. And I found that the DSLR just gives way better results and much sharper scans. Like you can see how, like, even with zero sharpening, like these scans are pretty good. You know, just a little bit of sharpening to bring the detail out, and that's all you need. And then it looks really nice. And that's really it. And I suppose that's really it. You know, for slide scans, they're just treated as normal raw photos. And I suppose that's it for this video. See you next time. Now, as for setting the white balance, most people will, you know, go into the Develop tab, set the white balance directly. Thanks, Adobe. I really need to know about Lightroom Mobile advertisement popping up in my software. Piss off.